I'm Big Don Luca, smoke you like my hookah. Pump fake right, then I step back in illusion. That's a boss move maneuver, billionaire entrepreneur. Mark Cuban on the viewer, put you rookies on a skewer. I stay shitting on you boys like I came up from the sewer. Used to have a lot of dollars, now I got a lot fewer. What you saying to me? I hope you save it for me. I'm about to kill the game, and I put it in my testimony.
Today we are going to be covering games 3 and 4 of the Mavericks playoff series versus the Clippers. Obviously, they won game 3 by, I believe, 9 points or something of that margin. Game 4, they lost in tantalizing fashion, 111 to 116 after coming back from a deficit of 31 points, taking the lead with a couple minutes left in the game, 105 to 104 off a miraculous Kyrie Irving layup. The Mavericks were obviously not able to hold on to the game, though. There's definitely a lot to get into with both of these two games, both drastically different in how the game sort of tracked as it went along. Kawhi Leonard did not play in this second matchup, game 4 that the Mavericks had at home. But of course, the Mavericks in game 3 put together a very stout defensive effort, and it can even be argued in game 4 they kind of did the same. The Clippers were hitting some extremely tough shots in game 4, but there's a lot to get into in terms of Luka Doncic not necessarily looking like himself, the Mavericks getting off to slower starts, as well as some just matchup adjustments that the Mavericks can make to give themselves a better advantage in this series potentially. But obviously, Jaren, it was a very heart-throbbing end and finish to that game 4 for Mavericks fans. Before we, go ahead and get into the intro, you have any brief thoughts about how the game sort of unraveled, especially with the Mavericks? Really, we were actually at game 4 for some of the listeners that, don't know, obviously. I don't think we told anybody that we were going, but we did indeed go. And, it did seem like the momentum was really about to, blow the door off the roof of the AAC if the Mavericks had completed that comeback. But it was just really draining to see their efforts fall short and, see that they just didn't have, the extra legs in those last few minutes to carry it over, home over the finish line.
Yeah, game 3 was obviously one of the highest of highs that the Mavericks have had this whole entire series, whether it was, the Russ and PG thing or PJ thing, with PJ obviously hitting, I guess you'd call it a shrug, crossing his arms over and giving the Clippers bench, a little love. And then obviously, game 4, being down 31 points, especially being in attendance, it was almost demoralizing, pretty embarrassing. And then obviously the Mavericks scratch and claw their way back with 2 minutes left in the third quarter was whenever we were like, okay, like this is actually a basketball game now. And then obviously Kyrie, I think he hit like a in transition 3 to cut it to 2 right before the fourth quarter begun. Like I said, game 3, the highest of highs, game 4 was obviously a lowest of lows. And, at the end of the day, it is the playoffs. If this is the regular season, you're playing against the Clippers and you come back down 31 and you end up losing by 5 points. It's like, okay, they made a valiant effort. They proved that they could stick with this team. Which, keep in mind, the Clippers are obviously a great team. But obviously, this is the playoffs. It's win or loss. You're still, at the end of the day, it's a 2-2 series. It's anybody's series, and the Clippers now have all the momentum headed back. They obviously have home court advantage on Wednesday, I believe it is. So it's anybody's series now. The Mavericks, easily could have. At the end of the day, I think game 4 is going to be talked about as missed opportunities, and then obviously a little bit of coaching errors, I would say, late in the fourth quarter. But I would say, game 4, and again, I know we'll get into this more, but I think game 4 came down to missed opportunities for the Mavericks. But in hindsight, yes, it was a great game. And, being a basketball fan, taking away bias from the Mavericks, like it was a fantastic game to watch and be in attendance for. But, obviously, it's still a 2-2 series. It could have easily swung 3-1 in Mavericks' favor.
Yeah, the Mavericks definitely had their opportunity to put the foot on the proverbial foot on the Clippers' neck and take control of this series, but they obviously weren't able to do so. Those are moments that you may look back upon if the Mavericks do lose this first round series for the Clippers for the third time in the last 5 or 6 years or however many years it is, that you look back upon and, you obviously pinpoint, hey, the Mavericks could have made a better adjustment here to, really take heed of this series, and they were unable to. One that I, can remember off the top of my head just with the Mavericks and Clippers playing in the last few years was in 2021, that game 3 I believe the Mavericks that got off to a pretty electric start. They were up by double
Yeah, it was like
digits in the first
32 to
quarter,
6. Yeah, or something like
and
that.
Rick Carlisle took a sort of ill-advised timeout. And from there on out, the Clippers were able to kind of regather themselves and get back in the game. Obviously, in hindsight, that timeout, went along to sort of seize a little bit of Dallas's momentum. Didn't seem like a major thing as it was happening in real time, but just things that are ever so marginal can easily disrupt the flow of a team that a team has in a playoff series, because these teams are so good at the top of the Western Conference and the Eastern Conference that are actually able to compete in the playoffs here. A lot of the times, unless it's like a 1-8 or a 2-7 game that's just kind of lopsided in the other team's favor, you're splitting hairs in between how good these teams are. So whatever, slight advantage they can get to, win within the margins is huge. And that is, a lot of what we'll get into throughout many different facets of the game, that the Mavericks, were just not good enough. We'll be getting into that here in terms of our game 4 coverage. But before we do that, we will have a quick break before we get into the start of the podcast. All right, Jaren. So starting off with game 3, even though it is a few days, we are a few days removed from it and whatnot, and we're not able to podcast right after game 3. We're going to be talking about game 4, I presume, a little bit more extensively, since that's a lot fresher on the mind. But I do think that game 3 is definitely good to backtrack to, especially because from the standpoint that we could get kind of negative when we start to talk about game 4. Especially with how the Mavericks started that game. But you look back at game 3, Kawhi Leonard was obviously playing in this contest before it was announced before game 4 that he could potentially miss the rest of the series. Lawrence Frank, Clippers GM, apparently the organization made a decision sort of in aggregate that Kawhi was going to be out game 4. We'll see how that goes going forward, but it does seem like the knee inflammation for Kawhi is something that has been a little bit more persistent than the Clippers and Kawhi himself originally anticipated. So we will obviously see how that goes, but nonetheless, in game 3 and in game 2 for that matter, we saw how Kawhi playing sort of affected the Mavericks in a positive manner, because the Clippers were doing a lot more to try and get him involved in the offense. Of course, in this game 3, he only had 7 field goal attempts throughout the game, and the Mavericks did a really good job of denying him the ball. But I think point blank, the Mavericks really didn't just come out and fall flat in their face just because Kawhi was playing, or even the fact that he was like a little bit hobbled. They didn't let any of that sort of noise in terms of his injuries in these in this game 2 and 3 for that matter get into their head. And in game 3 specifically, they limited Kawhi from really even being able to get into the flow of his offense. He often in one-on-one scenarios was passing the ball off before he could really get into that patented pull up mid-range jumper or try to get to the rim. The Mavericks did a really good job of using their strength to defend against them, as they did in game 2, and you could tell that he just wasn't as confident in his explosion, in his athleticism, both in game 2 and 3. So obviously that paid huge dividends for the Mavericks. Kawhi only played 25 minutes in the game. He went 4-7 from the field. And, with Paul George also having an off game, going 3 of 11, though, I will add, we'll talk about the Mavericks defense here in this game in a second, but the Mavericks in game 3 probably played their best game of the series. From a defensive standpoint. They ended up winning 90-101. I know I kind of botched the score in the intro, but the Mavericks held the Clippers, 10 points under 100 points, held all their stars to less than 20 points, barring James Harden, who I think literally only had like 21.
Yeah, 21.
That it was an excellent job across the board. The Mavericks, I guess the sort of sacrificial lamb there in this game was Norman Powell and Ivica Zubac. Norman Powell came and filled it up, off the bench for the Clippers. He was, coming off of pin downs and staggers, hitting those, contested, leaning sort of threes, but sometimes, he is one of the best players, off the bench in the NBA from an offensive standpoint when he gets hot. He was bound to have a good sort of revert back to the mean shooting game, and he did. And Zubac, he was very calculated in sort of how he was stacking the Mavericks centers in the post, as he has been all series. And he was able to, make his imprint on this game felt for sure. But with the Clippers, lack of shot creation in this game from their big three, and of course the Mavericks defense being sort of directly correlated to that, the Mavericks were able to do a really good job at frustrating the Clippers in this game. We saw Russell Westbrook multiple times get a little bit frustrated. He was exhibiting that with his play, sort of unnecessarily, grabbing some Mavericks players, doing some ticky-tacky stuff to try to, galvanize some energy from the Clippers perspective. And obviously, it didn't really work out for them. And, Westbrook ended up getting ejected. But it was definitely like one of the cooler moments of the season. When Westbrook kind of tried to get into Luka Doncic's face, and PJ Washington came over, and he was able to kind of disrupt things. They sort of got into a little bit of a shoving match there for a second. And then both, Westbrook and PJ Washington got ejected in the fourth quarter of the game. Of course, PJ Washington, had played excellent defense all night on the likes of Kawhi Leonard and Paul George when he was switched on to him. So it was a really big sort of statement from, that standpoint. And then PJ Washington, of course, if you're on YouTube, I'm sure we've seen everybody do this at this point, but hitting, the arms crossed, staring down the Clippers bench, sort of now definitely leaving his stamp as a 2-1-4 legend after that. It was a very cool moment in the playoffs. And, after that game 3 and, PJ Washington, sort of, I guess for lack of a better term, kind of shrugging off the Clippers, showing that the Mavericks defensive effort, was just too much for the Clippers in this contest. It really, what he did there definitely embodied that. But the momentum obviously was not carried on to game 4. And, I know we'll talk a little bit more about game 3, just in terms of like some specific guys that we thought played really well from a defensive perspective. Luka and Kyrie did not have the greatest shooting games. Obviously, Luka hasn't had really, an efficient shooting game this whole entire series, but I was really impressed with the Mavericks' grit and their ability to find different ways to win games. Obviously kind of similar to game 2 in that sense, even, one was on the road, one was at home. But the Mavericks, hung tight with the Clippers here. I thought PJ Washington, Derek Jones Jr. both played excellent defense on Kawhi Leonard and Paul George, respectively. Really made this challenging for the Clippers. Gafford had a much more improved game. He got some quick points off the bat. He obviously ended up getting some back spasms, I think in like the second quarter of this game. Or was that game 2?
No, it was game 2.
Game 2. Okay, that was my mistake. But yes, Gafford, despite him laboring a little bit, really throughout the last 2 games, he got off to a decent start. And, we finally saw the Mavericks be able to find some success with their, that rim rolling presence. And, Lively definitely carried over, when he was inserted into the lineup in game 3. And, that's something that we'll obviously talk more extensively about in game 4, how the big man rotation sort of ended up not turning out in the Mavericks' favor, potentially kind of contributed to them losing that game there at the end. But in terms of the minutes disparity between, both Kleber, Lively is second as well as Gaffer in this game, how Kidd played them, I thought he was wildly successful, and Lively is second, he was 6 for 8 on field goals. He was a dynamic rim rolling threat in this game. I thought both him and Gafford had a huge impact in this game. And, Josh Green, eight efficient points, got out in transition a few times, played some really good point of attack defense in this game. Between him, Derek Jones Jr., PJ Washington, they stepped up in the midst of Luka and Kyrie, not necessarily having the greatest offensive game, though, I thought Luka and Kyrie's defense in game 3 was much better than in game 4. So, from that perspective, I really thought this was maybe the only sort of game that the Mavericks role players almost kind of single-handedly won them the game in this series, just through how prolific their defensive effort was. But, it like I said, it gave me a lot of hope for this series going forward, even though the Mavericks did lose game 4. Just the fact that the Mavericks could win a game in this fashion when, from an offensive standpoint, with their 2 stars, everything was going wrong from an efficiency standpoint, really until Kyrie kind of started to get it going there in that third quarter, early fourth quarter stretch. But the Mavericks were still able to stay poised. The connectivity on defense was much better in this game. Guys were, trapping, and blitzing right as the Clippers were, anticipating trying to get downhill, in a pick and roll, stuff like that. The Mavericks, I just thought, were much more timely with their defensive rotations across the board in this game. And, it obviously sucks that that fell off a little bit in game 4. But as we've seen with the Mavericks, with the Clippers, and I know Kyrie Irving kind of talked about this post game in game 4, they definitely play stylistically a little bit different with Kawhi Leonard out of the lineup. Now, if this was a fully healthy Kawhi Leonard, I think that would definitely be a different story, because we've seen the Clippers dominate teams throughout stretches this regular season when they've had all 3 of their stars healthy. But with Kawhi trying to get acclimated into the flow of the game, and Kawhi and PG as well as Tyronn Lue, not forcing it to him, but making it a point of emphasis that his involvement is going to be paramount to their success. With him not being his full self, that's a big drop off in a playoff series, and that probably help kind of hurts some of the Clippers' offensive flow, kind of maybe attributed to Harden's drop offs in games 2 and 3. That obviously was not the case in games, in game 4 and whatnot, where Harden and PG were able to light the Mavericks up with some of their dynamic shot making, just some of the as well as their playmaking, for that matter, that we just didn't get to see on display as much as game 3. But like I said, despite all that, I was still proud of the Mavericks for handling business and getting some momentum back at home in a much needed game, because they needed obviously to win one of these games at home, preferably both, but at least they were able to take care of business in that game 3.
Yeah, and well, you pretty much said everything that I wanted to say, but
I kind of went on a tangent
no,
just so we could segue to game 4 a little faster.
No, yeah. But one aspect that I think that the Mavericks did establish throughout game 3 that the Clippers obviously corrected on, was the establishment of the pick and roll. The Mavericks throughout game 3 kind of hammered that home. They obviously against Utah Jazz in the regular season, they had was it 18 dunks in one game.
Oh, that one game, yeah.
And I want to say
maybe it may have been the game versus the Bulls even too.
I
know that was a high dunk game, because that's you might be right about that, but
I know the Jazz the
game versus the Bulls, that you're probably right. But the game versus the Bulls was another game late in the regular season where we saw the full effect of 48 minutes worth of rim rolling with Lively and Gafford. And I think they both scored in like 20 plus points in that game. That was hyper efficient, almost like I was like 20 for 22 across the board field goal wise. And that's a whole different scenario with the Bulls when you're comparing Zubac to Andre Drummond and Vucevic, who Andre Drummond is a sporadically good defender, but also his lack of quickness certainly hinders him, I think, in some spots. And Vucevic specifically this season, just not a good not a good defender whatsoever at this stage in his career.
But yeah, I would say that this was the first game 3 being where the Mavericks obviously did establish the pick and roll. I want to say they had 13 or 12 dunks throughout that game. So obviously, a high flying game. Derek Jones Jr. had his, and then obviously PJ. I want to say he caught a lob as well, and then obviously our rim rollers.
If he didn't, he at least had like one. There was a transition dunk that he had. I know that much. He definitely got a dunk.
Yeah, I know he definitely got a dunk. But yeah, a lot of dunks to be had in game 3. And then obviously I guess this is kind of our transition into game 4. The Clippers did a really good job of, making the correct adjustments in game 4 and, really taking away the Mavericks pick and roll and also the cutters at the rim. So, one of the ways, obviously, we were in attendance for that game, but one of the ways that the Clippers did a fantastic job was not just, clogging the rim and having one big, play in just major drop coverage. It wasn't that by any means. They also had a really, really good, or I guess a strong tag by the low side roller or by the low side help man. Oftentimes it was Russell Westbrook or Trey Mann or Terrence Mann. Terrence Mann, not Trey Mann. Oftentimes it was those two who were, those taggers. But the Clippers did a really good job of, whenever it was collapsing in the middle of the paint, getting their, I guess, respective defenders within the paint to obviously disrupt whatever was going on. The Mavericks, I would say throughout large periods of that game, up until really the 6-minute mark in the second quarter, I would say, were really struggling to get any offensive identity. I know, pretty much through the whole first quarter, the Mavericks did not have any stable offense outside of maybe a Luka and one connection with Daniel Gafford, I think it was on a lob. Outside of that, there was really just zero offense being produced or zero stable offense being produced. And then obviously the Clippers went on that massive run and they finished out the quarter with 39 points, obviously tagged on more with that in the second quarter. and stretched the lead to 31 points at the, I think, beginning of the second quarter mark. So obviously, the Mavericks made the correct adjustments throughout that game to get themselves back in it. They were only down by 16 entering the first half, or entering halftime rather, and then obviously clawed their way back throughout the game. But I would say one of the ways that the Clippers did come out was obviously elite shot making from Paul George and James Harden. Those two came out wanting to prove something, and they absolutely did. The whole pandemic P, whatever against the
Playoff
Mavericks.
P.
Yeah, now playoff P against the Mavericks is obviously far gone, and that's history now at this
He
point.
is in a much more mature stage in his career.
Yeah, without a doubt. But he came out in Game 4, and obviously, yeah, and he played great defensively. Yeah, from both sides of the floor, Paul George played amazing.
For those on YouTube, I just pointed out in the box score that
4 steals.
Paul George had 4 steals, which I didn't even know last night. Like I knew he had a couple deflections and whatnot. And obviously the Mavericks, 2 co-stars in Kyrie Irving and Luka Doncic, I think they had like a combined like 11 turnovers in this game. I know Kyrie had 7.
Yeah,
and there were a lot of instances of, some sort of lackadaisical, dribbles off the foot that kind of ill-timed things that hurt the Mavericks' comeback efforts, mistakes that probably were perpetuated by the fact that the Mavericks exerted so much energy to get back into this game.
Yeah.
But we cannot disregard Paul George's hand and or I guess if we're gonna get all figurative here, his hand in the cookie jar
Yes,
that he
absolutely.
had throughout the game.
No, but to add more to that, obviously me and Will were in attendance during the 2021 series, Game 6, where Kawhi probably had, maybe his best playoff performance of all time. And obviously that's, outside of Luka's 60-20-10 game, that's probably the best in-person performance I've ever seen. But right up there with that is definitely Paul George's 33 points in Game 4. I want to say he finished the first half with 26. Everything he did was just so methodical. I'm not trying to, I guess hop on the Paul George.
Still a Mavericks podcast.
Yeah, it's
guys.
still Mavericks podcast, but I do have to give him his flowers. Paul George had an amazing game. James Harden definitely down the stretch redeemed himself. He after the first quarter really struggled.
I wouldn't even say he struggled after the first quarter. I'd say
yeah.
I'd say the Mavericks did
Yeah.
a better job at, not letting him, just get into that easy
spot.
pick and roll action
Yeah.
until obviously the final 2 minutes of the game where that notion completely fell.
Yeah, no. I want to say he had like I might be completely wrong, but I know he had like 12 points in the fourth quarter, all of which came by like that little that floater range rather. But yeah, to once again, Paul George, an amazing game. And obviously it took 33 points from both Paul George and James Harden to beat the Mavericks in this game. From a defensive standpoint, I want to say the Mavericks, kind of directed their focus after that first half on Paul George. Obviously, he had 26, like I said, going into halftime. Mavericks did a good job of making adjustments up until late in the fourth quarter, whenever he had 2 ridiculous threes, or 1 ridiculous 3 that I can recall. He finished the game with 7 made 3-pointers, which might be a playoff high for him. I'm not sure.
I believe it is 7 and 10. Though.
Yeah, 7 and 10.
Hyper efficient.
Yeah. So the Mavericks did a good job of making the adjustments in the second half of, stopping Paul George. Obviously, it was at the cost of James Harden and some other role players. But going into Game 4, obviously there was a lot of momentum on the shelf rather, and the Mavericks obviously could have taken the 3-1 series lead. They had their opportunities and whatnot. But the Clippers did simply, I would label it as enough to get the job done, and then obviously go home into Game 5 with all the momentum. Well, I know that we're going to deep dive a little bit more into this, so I'll let you get going. But amazing game from Paul George.
No, for sure. Him and James Harden unequivocally played their 2 best games of the series in the same game. And that obviously, we're not trying to make any excuses for the Mavericks here, but those were definite, some of the shot making that, I saw from James Harden and Paul George in the first quarter was just especially some of the threes that they were making specifically early on. Probably some of the best individual shot making I've ever seen in any game, especially, take a step further, a game that I've attended, obviously. So, as much as that definitely sucked and it felt like it was the sort of nail in the coffin every time the Clippers hit a 3 to extend their lead from 24 to 27, then to a, 1.31, obviously. It obviously, just felt, ever, more so insurmountable of a lead that the Mavericks would be able to come back from. So, it was obviously special that the Mavericks were able to fight back in this game. spearheaded by some, honestly, just some heroic shot making by
Yeah.
Kyrie Irving when the Mavericks offense started to look, stagnant. Things, drastically took a turn at the end of that second quarter. But look, I kind of wanted to backtrack and get, to the first quarter, look at some of the reasons that the Mavericks may be having these slow starts. Obviously, we can, make the sort of narrative excuse here that, with Kawhi Leonard not playing, the Mavericks perhaps are underestimating the Clippers in some sort of fashion, think, okay, like it's going to be a little bit easier than it is with Kawhi out, and perhaps that could be attributed to their slow starts. Luka Doncic mentioned in his post-game interview that, the Mavericks have obviously gotten off to slower starts on 2 day games, both Sunday matinee games. The Mavericks have not been able to get out of the gates hot. I don't know if that's the Mavericks just not being able to adapt to, playing a game earlier in the day, and that, just sacrificing some of their energy, some of their morale. I don't know. Obviously, I would assume that probably isn't the case in the playoffs, at least from a mental perspective for individual players on the Mavericks. But that could be something like subconsciously that sort of just the Mavericks, in the back of these guys' heads, where earlier games just are not compatible with the Mavericks for whatever reason. I don't know. You can find any of one of these like sort of weird nitpicky excuses that you want to attribute to why the Mavericks really couldn't get off to a good start in the first quarter. But overall, I think honestly that a big part of it right now is just the way that the Mavericks are, how they play stylistically. If we look at like the last 20 games, last even like, or that's just more sort of microcosm. If we really want to extend, you know, the scope of our viewing here and like look at how the Mavericks have played throughout the entire regular season, the Mavericks often try to get their offense going through Luka, build him in as that, sort of impenetrable force throughout, I guess, the first half that a lot of times just kind of takes teams aback if he gets off to a hot start, if he gets to the rim a few times, nails a few step back threes, can totally just throw a team's game plan into a blunder in terms of, trying to throw the kitchen sink at Luka to cover, to, try and find a way to stop him. And in turn, that definitely, I'd say provides a lot more spacing for other Mavericks on the court, including Kyrie Irving. And, kind of we see him tend to get going. But with Luka obviously dealing with this knee soreness, not having looked for, like himself throughout 4 games. I apologize to any of the Slovenian listeners, but, Luka is not, barring game 2, where he, probably played the best defensive game of his whole career. And, he, even in game 4, while he didn't look as good as he has, that the last few games defensively, he's still exhibiting more effort than we've ever seen on that end. Perhaps that in tandem with his knee being sore, him not being at 100% in these playoffs, is just not the formula for, his offense in the first half, especially, we do have to give credit, as good as Luka is, he is a human being at the end of the day. Like the Clippers have some extremely lengthy wings.
Yeah.
Paul George is like 6'9", 6'10" with great length. Terrence Mann, Amir Coffey, even with Kawhi out, they still have really dynamic defenders in that starting 5. And obviously, even though Norman Powell and Westbrook aren't the most lengthy guys, they're still like stouter, guys at, 6'3", 6'4", who have good length for their size and, are no pushovers in terms of getting, in terms of being able to get bullied to the basket by Luka, even if they're not as tall as him. So, the Clippers, their 8-man rotation right now, obviously, presents a lot of challenges for, really any team that, has multiple point of attack ball handlers and shot creators. But, specifically if Luka is hobbled and he can't get to the rim at the same pace and, his legs aren't underneath him and he's finding a hard time, being able to score on one-on-one scenarios, a lot of the time, a lot of the times that he was able to score in one-on-one scenarios yesterday was like a mid-range fadeaway off of a post up or something, something that didn't involve a ton of physical exertion to get to the basket. We saw him obviously settle for a lot more step back threes on the, as Jaren mentioned earlier, I believe he ended up finishing 1 for 9 from 3 on the game, which is, in a playoffs game, I think it kind of goes without saying that that just can't happen if the Mavericks want to give themselves a good chance to win. So, just taking that into consideration, Jaren, what do you think maybe is the Mavericks, what is plaguing them in these first quarters, I guess specifically in games 4 and 1? And do you think that, a diversification of the offense, trying to establish Kyrie as more of a focal point maybe early on could help the Mavericks if Luka's not going to be able to uh, exhibit that he can get to the rim at the same pace, especially in the first quarter. You'd anticipate that that's when his legs would be the freshest, that's when he'd look the best, but it has been the complete opposite of that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that you pretty much highlighted it. The Mavericks, lack of variety in terms of their offensive movements has really hurt them throughout early parts of this, first half really of games 1 and 4. I think the Mavericks, sole, I guess, relying ability or whatnot on the pick and roll has really hurt them. I know that we highlighted this as this was happening, but the Mavericks, need to establish off-ball movements, off-ball screens to get guys open. This is obviously what happened, barring, Kyrie Irving just heroic shot making here and there. This is what the Mavericks really did well throughout those, latter half of the past 3 quarters. In game 4 was that they were creating a lot of off ball movements for guys to get open, or, it was a simple, swing pass or motion, whatnot, drive and kick sort of game. And, that's
Yeah.
a little bit of how the Mavericks bread and butter has been, throughout the regular season, and obviously, their 2 wins in the series. But the Mavericks, have to establish some sort of different identity to start these games. And if you've noticed, I guess a trend in these first 2 games, like yes, they're during matinee games and whatnot, but not even to say that the energy isn't there, because obviously the energy was there in game 4. There was so much more on game 4 in terms of the game 1 in terms of what was on the line. Obviously an ability to go up 3-1 headed into LA and whatnot. There's a lot more, so the energy was not in question for this game. What was in question, however, was obviously, like we said, just a lack of variety in offense. Games 2 and games 3, we saw role players take a big, sort of piece of the cake, I guess, off of the plate of Doncic and Irving. And this is kind of what we didn't see. Obviously Derrick Jones Jr. had himself a great game. PJ Washington, another pretty much 10-point performance. But we need to see, not just role players to take more of an, I guess, more of the, a role, but we need to see the offense, really establish these guys in the role. I think that there's a lack of
Yeah,
variety.
it's definitely not all on the role players.
No, and that's
Yeah,
what I'm trying to
that's what
say.
Jaren's saying.
Is it like, it's not these guys' fault. Like obviously Derrick Jones Jr., had himself a great game yesterday, but a lot of these guys are almost victim to, I guess, the system that the Mavericks do run, which is that, high pick and roll, high screen sort of system. And, if that's not rolling, or if that's not working, I guess rolling for a better term, if that's not working, obviously the offense is going to struggle, and that's what happened.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think the Mavericks, like the focal point of the Mavericks offense, given their personnel, it's not bad for them to, establish that high screen and roll as the
Well, they have to
driving.
establish
Yeah,
it.
they
If
have to
don't-
establish
if
that
they
as the
don't,
driving
yeah.
force of their
Yeah.
offense. But the Mavericks sort of get into a blunder when that's all they're running, and the Clippers can, anybody can key in on a pick and roll. There were stretches throughout last night, and Jaren and I had a pretty good angle on it too, to where we were up in the upper section of the AAC. We could see the whole court for most of the game. Sometimes can't really see that as good on broadcast perspective on TV. But the Mavericks, like, there was a lot of stagnation in that first half from the Mavericks role players. And I don't know if I'd attribute that necessarily all being their fault. It looked like it was kind of by design, but the Mavericks were, strictly just using either, a Gafford Kyrie pick and roll or a Luka Kyrie pick and roll to open things up. Maybe there would be some sort of horns action, where Kyrie would, both Gafford and Kyrie would come set a screen, at the point of attack, and then Luka would sort of pick a direction if he wanted to redirect Kyrie on the other wing. He'd swing it back out, and then they try to run a pick and roll through Kyrie and Gafford. That's essentially kind of how the first half was. There was a couple times where the Mavericks, a select few times rather, that Irving and Doncic were able to kind of get into the paint. And in those instances, we saw PJ Washington, Derrick Jones Jr., hard cut to the rim. But that's obviously kind of going off more basketball instincts than anything that's necessarily by design. Just seeing a guy, penetrate to the rim and, making a slaughter, a dive cut, that's definitely very savvy on those guys' part. And I thought, both PJ and Derrick Jones Jr. Played great on both sides of the ball tonight. Maybe, besides PJ's late fourth quarter defense on Harden. But, that's with them essentially, being non-threats in that first half. It gives the Clippers the ability to just key in on Luka and Kyrie. And, when they're bringing like timely traps like they were, and The Mavericks didn't really have much outside of, Gafford and Lively in that pick and roll. And obviously, I thought Lively specifically in that second quarter really, was able to establish himself a couple times with a couple offensive rebounds as well as some, deep catches to where he was able to, sort of get behind Zubac in the lob game. And, even if he wasn't throwing a lob directly, he positioned himself, down low, sealed him in the dunker spot to where he could, you know, tip the ball back out if the Mavericks got a shot on the rim, or he was in prime position to catch a lob. So I obviously Gafford's dealing with some back stuff and whatnot, but he I thought in this game didn't really do the Mavericks any favors in that first half in terms of his rim presence not necessarily being as accelerated as we've seen. He's definitely looked, I think, just a little bit slower getting into some of these actions offensively. And when that's the Mavericks' like only action that they're running, especially throughout times in that first half, you're bound to sort of kick the tread and the tires a little bit too hard. We saw Gaffer kind of get burnt out. He was getting bumped around a lot physically, especially with how much the Mavericks were kind of using him in those pick and roll actions, and that definitely hurt the diversification of the offense. Mavericks have a lot of different things with the guys on the court that they can do. They can run back cuts for the likes of PJ Washington, Derek Jones Jr., something we've rarely seen in this series, except maybe a couple times if in transition, which really isn't even a back cut. Obviously, PJ Washington had a nice lob, I think, in the first half yesterday, where he was able to kind of slip behind the Clippers. But I mean, like I said, that was kind of in a transition scenario. We haven't really seen the Mavericks do too many different things. We haven't seen, I'd like to see more of PJ and Derek Jones Jr. Screening for Kyrie and Luca, off of pin downs and whatnot. We occasionally see them as like one of the guys who's screening for them in a stagger, but the Mavericks just really aren't. They're not doing things in terms of moving guys through the middle of the court. Besides the pick and roll, and there's just no off-ball offensive action from these role players. In the middle of the court, we saw a little bit more in the second half. I think that guys were a little bit more privy to cutting when they saw Kyrie was able to get to the paint a couple times. And there was even a couple times I thought that the Mavericks drew some plays up for maybe Derek Jones Jr. or PJ. There was one play specifically where Kyrie kicked it out to Derek Jones Jr. on the wing, but he did so kind of as like Derek Jones Jr. was essentially working off the catch. He had, he was running to the ball as he was caught it, even though he was at like the 3-point line, and he was able to give a little bit of a jab step, and I can't remember who exactly was guarding him, but then that was able to open up the lane for him to throw down like a crazy poster dunk on Zubac. That could have even been crazier if Zubac didn't like whack his ass in the face. So, just like doing different things like that. I think there was a time that PJ got a screen set by him by like one of Luka or Kyrie, and he was able to get to his floater there in the first half. Like those are like little micro instances of those guys contributing on offense, and obviously they're not gonna Luka and Kyrie are the primary driving forces here. We know that, but if you can get those guys, even if that's not going to be a play that clicks every single time, if you can use those actions off ball to open up more things for Luka and Kyrie, and just throw the Clippers off kilter a little bit. The Mavericks don't do anything. There's a lot of NBA teams, and I know we see this in college more because they have a 35-second shot clock, but there's a lot of NBA teams that still like when you have these dynamic stars in the playoffs and you have these A+ tier defenders on the other side like the Clippers do. Like the Mavericks need to run some actions they need to run some initial actions to get to their like actual actions. And they don't do anything to, cause and especially in that first half, to cause the Clippers to scram switch. The Clippers were able to stay persistent with most of their defensive matchups throughout this entire night. Seemed like Paul George, as well as, like that. I mean, Terrence Mann rather, and Amir Coffey were obviously like the primary defenders on Luka. And, if the Mavericks were drawing a switch, oftentimes it was Paul George getting onto one of those guys, which The Clippers
That's a favorable
obviously,
switch.
yeah, that's a favorable
Yeah.
switch. The Clippers would like to preserve Paul George's legs, especially in a game where Kawhi's not playing. That's obviously why they're, matching him up on one of Derrick Jones Jr. or PJ Washington on defense throughout the game. A guy who's definitely a pseudo offensive threat, but not a real, playmaking, shot creation, sort of primary option. But look, that shows the Clippers' versatility. It shows that, the Mavericks have to be able to mix things up more. And when Luka is not able to he's not able to take advantage of the likes of Zubac and James Harden getting switched on to him in the instances that does happen, and isn't able to get to the rim. That's obviously going to hinder the Mavericks offense pretty drastically, and we saw that ad nauseum in Game 4.
Yeah, absolutely. And I liked your note about, I guess, the Mavericks need more off ball cutting and more off ball movement. I did like that note a lot because you saw throughout that second quarter, whenever the Mavericks were attempting to make that comeback before halftime, Derrick Jones Jr., I know PJ Washington even benefited off of some of it. But whenever it was Lively and Kyrie running the pick and roll, they would obviously have their initial movement where the two get downhill and whatnot. And then obviously a slot cut at the top of the key would, for the most part, it was Derrick Jones Jr. But sometimes it was PJ Washington. They'd come down and they'd either get an easy rebound or they would get a pass back to them for a floater.
And oftentimes, and I hate to interrupt you real
No, you're
quick,
fine.
but
You're fine.
in the second half, something that I thought was kind of inspiring from the Mavericks was because the Mavericks did win a lot of really crucial 50-50 balls last
Yes.
night. They also lost a couple that were kind of unfortunate, but I thought that they, like from an effort and energy perspective, they did a really good job of that stuff. And, in the playoffs, teams are trying to get their defense, reset as fast as ever. It's not like every time that you get an offensive rebound, you can just go straight up or, find an easy shot, kind of like in the regular season. I thought the Mavericks did do a good job in those kind of scramble situations. Like if the Mavericks had an advantageous scenario off of a rebound and like two guys were already down the court for the Clippers, maybe Luka was already trying to go down the court. I thought the Mavericks, like in that, those like 4-on-3, 3-on-2 scenarios, did a really good job of finding their shooters in the second half.
In the second, yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I guess adding to my note, like, adding diversification, adding, off ball movements is really going to be the key to unlocking the Clippers. Obviously, I would say, from the second quarter on until the final buzzer, the Mavericks won the game. I saw a tweet by Tim Cato, like, because there's obviously, I do want to get into this before we end the podcast, is the fourth quarter, or I guess lack of fourth quarter rotational adjustments from Jason Kidd. But whenever that was brought up, Tim Cato put out a tweet. He was like, the Mavericks didn't lose this game because Maxi Kleber played 10 minutes in the fourth quarter. They lost this game because they went down by 31 points. I don't necessarily agree with that because obviously the Mavericks, found ways to get back in this game. Like, yes, they dug themselves a pretty deep hole.
Yes.
But, at the same time, I guess we're already getting into this, but at the same time, Jason Kidd has to understand it came down to opportunities and it came down to missed opportunities in the case of the Mavericks. Whether a win or loss was going to happen. Obviously, the series could have been 3-1. Had Derrick Jones Jr. not missed that dunk, had Maxi Kleber maybe played 2 less minutes, and Derek Lively was subbed in for a few more minutes in the fourth quarter. Whatever it was, it came down to missed opportunities for the Mavericks. And I think at the end of the day, yes, the Mavericks were down 31 points, and they clawed back, and I even had a lead at one point.
In large part due to Kyrie Irving.
Yeah,
like we
due
said,
to Kyrie.
like,
Yeah. Like Kyrie had an amazing game. We're not giving him enough credit here.
And the Mavericks probably don't even go on this run if not late in the second quarter. Kyrie hits like 2 transition threes.
Yeah.
I think he hit like a pull-up mid-range jump shot as well. I had like a little 8-point, 9-point run, or it was an and one that he had as well.
And one, yeah.
He had a 9-point run by himself that that cut the lead to like 22 or something like that.
Yeah.
And the Mavericks obviously were able to gain some momentum and make a little bit of a run there. But it took a lot of variables falling in place for the Mavericks to even make this run. And it took them, playing some of the best basketball that we've seen throughout a stretch. And obviously, the cliche answer is yes, they need to do that for 48 minutes. Obviously, easier said than done.
Yeah.
But, it is weird, the Mavericks' tendency that we've seen at points in this series to go away from things that are working.
Yeah.
And Jaren and I talked about this in the fourth quarter. I'm sure that there is a lot of fan divide on the center rotation, but this is essentially the last thing that we'll really deep dive into before we end this podcast. So we'll definitely do our due diligence here just in terms of our opinions on this whole situation. And look, okay, at first, I hear the post game quotes from Jason Kidd about, wanting to get that, spacing from Maxey and how quintessential that is to the Mavericks offensive attack. And look, I get it. I do understand that that provides more, um, you know, room for Luka and Kyrie to operate. And when you're trying to get those guys going late in the fourth quarter, that is of the utmost importance. But playoffs are such a momentum based things, and something I really liked about Rick Carlisle when he was the Mavericks coach is he would have a tendency to always ride the hot hand or who was,
Yeah.
playing well in a given series. We've seen throughout times when the Mavericks played the Clippers the last few years, especially when the, Kristaps Porzingis was relegated to the corner, became a non-factor, that whole situation. The Clippers have gone small ball and they've had enough length to be able to disrupt the Mavericks with that. They've been able to play Paul George at the four. They've been able to put, Kawhi, like Robert Covington, just stacking, their entire lineup with 3-and-D wings and then a point guard. The Clippers are still very dynamic in terms of their wings and their versatility, but I just wouldn't say they're quite as lengthy, quite as stout as they were back in those, 2021 and 2020 series. Just from a defensive standpoint, if you look at their personnel then compared to now, especially when Kawhi's not playing,
Yeah.
I mean, I don't even think that's an argument when we're looking at game 4. And, when you take that into consideration, it just is, and the Clippers are playing Zubac more than they ever have, since Luka really hasn't been able to take advantage of that mismatch. There haven't really been a lot of situations where the Clippers have, done, so bad from a defensive rotation standpoint that Zubac has got onto Kyrie. I think they've avoided that matchup,
Yeah.
almost in totality, barring maybe a couple possessions of the series. And when you take that into consideration, that Zubac is out here, being a pretty stout presence in the dunker spot for the Clippers to close this game and getting some, he didn't have the biggest rebounding perspective. That's what like I said, nobody on the Clippers had over even 6 rebounds in this game. The Mavericks won a lot of 50-50 balls. They drastically out rebounded the Clippers. Clippers only had 29 rebounds on the game. The Mavericks had 42. Like Jaren said, like the effort, energy was not a question in this game. That's what sucks the most about it is the Mavericks poured everything that they had into the tank at the end, and they were still denied. And look, like we were, about this whole center argument. I know I kind of did a few laps around the track before I'm finally circling back to this, but with Zubac here, playing late in the fourth quarter, playing these essential minutes, it just is questionable why Jason Kidd thinks that the Mavericks need the spacing that the Maxi Kleber brings on offense so much. Maxi Kleber hit a big 3 in that fourth quarter, and that was the only points of the game. It was big for him to step up in that moment. Pivotal shot that he hit. That's not an easy shot when you haven't been shooting. It's his only field goal attempt of the game. Like props to Maxi for stepping up. I didn't think that there was anything that he did individually wrong to really warrant any hate on Twitter. But look, um, his spacing, in my opinion at least, was just not of the utmost concern from an offensive perspective when the Clippers are still playing big, still playing Zubac in the game late in that fourth quarter. We maybe have a different case here if the Clippers were going small and that was something that was pestering the Mavericks from haunting them on offense. But the Mavericks were scoring at a pretty high volume in that fourth quarter. Yes, I do agree that 5-out lineup definitely helped them, tie for their highest scoring quarter of this game. They had 33 in both the second and fourth quarter. But if the Mavericks defense played, well enough, and we saw with the way that, Derrick Jones Jr. was able to, he actually made 2 threes. You probably don't get that out of him again this series.
Yeah, probably not. That's a
And
wasted opportunity.
Yeah, and it's like, stuff like that. The Mavericks role players really actually kicking in. The Mavericks being able to attack the Clippers in the 4-on-3 when they got doubled at the point of attack. We saw Lively move the ball well in that third quarter.
Yes.
It wasn't just
Yes.
exactly. Like it wasn't just strict pick and roll. And I think as well as Lively was playing, maybe not with Gafford tonight, because like we kind of talked about his physicality, just didn't look like, I don't know if it was his back. I definitely think that he was kind of laboring at points from what we saw on the court, but he just didn't look like his complete self from, an athletic and physical standpoint, which look, it's the playoffs, shit's going to happen. You kind of have to, I think Gafford's injury is kind of minor right now, but the Mavericks have to be able to supplement with him not out there. And it's like, you have a first team all rookie center. I get he's only a rookie. These are very high intensity scenarios. But he proved in game 3, he proved in game 2 that, these issues, affecting him outside of basketball are not something that's going to have an effect on him in this series, which, really speaks to his maturity, especially how he's handled himself, not having a consistent role in this series, still playing really hard every time he's in. It just makes no sense as to why Derek Lively is second. did not close the game yesterday for the Mavericks. And if we want to break down this, you know, like stylistically, just to, really put the nail in the coffin in terms of nailing my point here. We'll take it down to the last couple minutes of the fourth quarter when James Harden was getting into the lane,
Yeah.
and the Mavericks, didn't have the rotation at the backside to be able to do anything. Okay, I thought the Mavericks were kind of, playing James Harden to his step back. I saw a couple other Mavericks podcasts actually saying that they were kind of trying to guard James Harden's hand, guard Paul George by a hand. I don't think the Mavericks are that naive in their defensive coverage in a playoff series to where, they're trying to force the, either Paul George or James Harden a certain way. James Harden has a really good sort of hesitation escape dribble, and he also he has a very good subtle right arm in terms of being able to keep it close to his body, but kind of use it to extend defenders or extend away from defenders to where the referee can't see because it's like ever so marginal, but it's also sort of effective. Like he's been doing this shit. He has these tricks in his toolbox for years, right? So I'm getting kind of heated. But with the Mavericks, I don't think the Mavericks were, necessarily trying to push James Harden a certain direction. I saw that on Twitter, some other podcasts. I do think that they were trying to play him to his step back. And I mean, like the Mavericks were anticipating that James Harden was going to shoot late in that fourth quarter because some of the crazy threes that he was hitting earlier in the game. And he, barring that first half of the game one, James Harden hadn't, hit some of the crazy step back threes that he had hit in that first quarter. Yeah. So I get PJ Washington, Derek Jones Jr. maybe trying to play him more like that, trying to anticipate the 3-pointer, and that subsequently leading to Harden being able to get into the lane a few times. The primary thing here is obviously the Mavericks. Yes, they can't get beat at the point of attack. Should they bring a double from the stronger weak side to obviously negate Harden in that instance, that would obviously leave somebody else open. I think that's a pretty good argument. I know Russell Westbrook was playing. I don't think he was closing the game, but he obviously got some minutes there in that fourth quarter, and he had a pretty abysmal shooting game outside of one corner three that he hit off of a second chance opportunity earlier on in the second half. I thought the Mavericks could have maybe done a better job of just funneling the offense to the likes of some of the other Clippers role players. But look, the Clippers had they had Terrence Mann closing, who hit 3 of 6 threes in this game. I believe Norman Powell was closing the game there. They had some consistent shooters. I get that you can't necessarily leave any one guy open, but I would have maybe liked to see them test the waters a little bit more there. But we kind of saw that in the third quarter, and Terrence Mann, at the end of the third quarter, I think beginning of the fourth quarter, toasted them on a couple open threes. But it kind of really came down to the Mavericks getting beat at the point of attack. Even if they weren't getting beat at the point of attack, the Clippers did a good job in the 4-on-3. Zubac was able to find those guys, or even if they were, using Paul George or Amir Coffey to screen, everybody in that Clippers starting lineup did a good job of, being able to, showcase the Mavericks' negligence from that perspective and be able to beat them in those scenarios. But it's like if you take Maxi Kleber out, right, and you put Derek Lively a second in. And, the Mavericks obviously are still getting beat at the point of attack by PJ Washington late there. And I think PJ's got to be better there. I think Derek Jones Jr. maybe even has to be a little bit marginally better, just specifically in how they're covering Harden. I thought most of Paul George's performance was just due to some insane shot making. He did a great job getting downhill. He had 8 assists in this game. But it's like, you got to, if you have that rim protecting presence in there to be able to at least get a handoff, show some sort of contest on Harden. If these guys are getting beat at the point of attack, that obviously would be crucial. Now, the direct counter argument to that is yes, Zubac would be left wide open underneath the basket for the lob threat. James Harden is very savvy in terms of being able to find the guy in the dunker spot if the big comes up and rotates in that help scenario. But if the Mavericks, have Lively out there, maybe they're playing Maxi alongside Lively as the fourth sort of guy that's able to rotate over to Zubac from the weak side there. If they're playing some sort of lineup like that, you have enough size and you probably have enough spacing on offense to get by. We'll get into that in a second. But you have enough size to be able to supplement if your guys are getting beat at the point of attack. And as crucial as that was down the stretch of the game, it just seemed inexcusable that as well as Lively was playing on both sides of the ball, that he didn't at least get, a crack to show what he had there. the Maverick, Jason Kidd, went with Maxey. He's obviously been more trusted in these scenarios. He's been on the Mavericks longer. I get that whole thing, the whole veteran argument being in a playoff game. I get Maxey's experience in that situation is invaluable. But with the Clippers not playing small ball on the other end, I just really don't think, as good as defense as the Clippers were playing in this game, they don't have as dynamic of a defensive roster as they had a couple years ago. And, with Kawhi out, the Clippers rotations, on the backside across the board, I thought were phenomenal last night in terms of how their defensive coverage, sort of was, I guess, kind of juxtaposed to the Mavericks. They did a really good job of trusting in their rotations, but I thought that they were also, especially given Luka's knee thing, they were a lot more stout at the point of attack. They were able to live with the likes of some of their weaker defenders like Harden or Zubac on an island one-on-one because the Mavericks weren't able to take advantage of it, at points in this game. But, I just think the Mavericks having more size, using PJ Washington to rotate over as the low man, as we saw almost all night in that third quarter. He had a ton of crazy blocks in this game. Being able to rotate over as a weak side shot blocker. I get Zubac is a huge presence, but if the Mavericks really paid enough attention to it, I think they give themselves a better shot. And Harden maybe misses one of those floaters if Lively, maybe one or two of those floaters if Lively's able to get, step up for a better contest. I mean, there was a couple times that Maxey, just because of the size disadvantage that he has on Zubac, as well as the Mavericks, I think, obviously, the Clippers shooting lineup they had on there, they weren't trying to leave open any guy from the corner. I get that, but, as well as, the Mavericks, PJ Washington, or, Derrick Jones Jr. really in those instances, because PJ Washington was guarding Harden, as well as Luka. Both of those guys I thought probably could have done a better job at crashing, from the weak side or strong side, I guess, really kind of in Luka's scenario, to come in, get a, try to disrupt Zubac if the dump off pass happened there in those late game scenarios. But we never even saw that. Harden just kind of waltzed his way into the lane for like 3-4 consecutive floaters. And after that, really tough Paul George corner three that we had referenced earlier in the game, the Clippers were able to, just build a bit of a 6 to 8 point lead. Mavericks tried through a couple Kyrie shots late, and then the last couple minutes to give themselves a brief spark of light. They played the free throw game a little bit, but ultimately the Clippers were able to just get up by too much late in the game. They had the extra juice to be able to beat the Mavericks there.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think Willie, once again, pretty much every game that I had.
Sorry, I've been a little heated after.
No, I get it. It's definitely one of those games, but yeah, I'm not gonna try and justify Maxey playing 10 minutes in that fourth quarter. But one of the reasons why I did think that he played that was because the Mavericks' failure. And we mentioned this during the game, the Mavericks' failure to get over whatever said hump, whatever it was. We thought the hump was trying to get the lead in this game, and then after that, the Mavericks are pretty much going to take care of business. But we saw the Mavericks take a 105-104 lead with 2.5 minutes left, and then obviously that did not do them any favors because Paul George goes down, hits a crazy three, and then pretty much from there on out, James Harden pretty much does his thing. But to Maxey's not to Maxey's credit, okay, I'm sorry, I'm going all over the place right now, but that was where Derek Lively II should have been in the game. Was those final 2 minutes. The Mavericks were trying
really
to
like final 4 or 5 minutes. Like I have no issue with Maxey.
No, this is not a knock on him.
Yeah,
it's not a knock on him at all.
Nor do I have an issue with the Mavericks. Playing two different bigs in the fourth quarter. It's 12 minutes of basketball. I like the fact that they needed to get an offensive jolt there, and I was not mad at those Maxey minutes. But late in the game, as tightly as contested as things tend to be, with stars. Really just making their mark in the mid range in those really, in those clutch affairs, or just with, tough ass shots like we saw with Paul George. I just thought the Mavericks could have controlled the controllables, Jason Kidd specifically, by putting Lively in there. And, like I said, it's not something that, like Maxey playing the whole 12 minutes did not necessarily single-handedly lose the Mavericks the game, but one of the biggest factors in losing the game down the stretch was definitely the Mavericks' inability to guard Harden and simple pick and roll scenarios. Sometimes literally getting beat off the dribble on single dribble blow-bys. And if Harden's going to waltz into the lane for some easy floaters, get to his left hand, I get he is dynamic in terms of being able to get downhill and whatnot, even at his age. And, that and one that he had at the end that bounced in off the rim like twice, definitely kind of put the nail in the coffin in terms of sealing the Clippers win. But, the Mavericks just could have extended, their rim protecting bigs out there, specifically Lively, to deter some of that late in the game. And as well as that had worked, and as well as the Mavericks offense was still playing, and Zubac still being late in the game in the fourth quarter, like the Mavericks had a 16, or Mavericks won the third quarter 29-16, and that was like primarily with Gafford and Lively playing a bulk of the minutes there. It's just puzzling, why Jason Kidd doesn't trust one of those guys to close down the stretch. I don't know if it is just, a trust thing as a coach. Having Maxey out there, he's played more seasons with him. He's a veteran, obviously, like I kind of referenced. I don't know exactly what his motives are there. I, would think that, I understand the whole small ball thing, but I just think that you have to be able to make those micro adjustments in the game. And I think Tyronn Lue has done a better job of doing that throughout this series. I think the Mavericks game-to-game adjustments have been good, but in terms of in-game adjustments, I think the Mavericks have just not been able to match the Clippers from that vantage point.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, pretty much nailed game 4, but yeah, I mean,
Yeah,
and look, I don't want to show or throw too much shade at Jason Kidd because he's obviously, throughout this whole entire series and, even for the game time adjustments, I think that he's overall done a great job as a head coach. I think, obviously the game to game adjustments have been way better than the in game adjustments,
yeah,
but this was the one time where I felt like Jason Kidd really messed up. It
yeah.
was not by putting, not putting Lively, Gafford, I can understand. Gafford was having a rough game, but not putting Lively in those final 5, 4, even 2 minutes, and giving the Mavericks some life on the defensive end. That's where I really feel like Jason
I
Kidd
mean, it's
messed
not
up.
like Lively was having a
Yeah,
bad offensive game. He was 4 for 4 when he was in.
yeah,
I mean, albeit obviously all those are, pretty easy attempts at the rim, but he had like an and one. I mean, the actions just they looked a lot better. It seemed like Lively's athleticism was something that even was deterring Zubac at points, just in terms of his ability to slip fast. I didn't, like we talked about, Gafford just hasn't had that same explosion, ever since he's kind of started suffering back spasms early on in the series, in terms of getting to the rim. But I think if anything, Lively's ability to rim run, get behind the defense. There was even a couple times I know Gafford, re-screen, set a Gortat screen. I think there was one or two times Lively did it in that third period as well. And, he's proving that, he, you know, is an astute enough student of the game, as well as discipline in terms of his offensive awareness to be on the court in those scenarios. He can survive spacing wise. I thought he played really good perimeter defense when he was, had a unfair defensive switch that he had to kind of guard out, go and guard Harden. I thought he switched him into some tough spots a couple times as he has throughout this series. Just didn't make too much sense. And I think, I'm gonna hit this, you know, hit this point on the head with the hammer one more time, just to kind of backtrack a little bit. But Luka Doncic, I know this is not fair because he's been battling this knee soreness all series, and it is a tough ask of him to be able to play better. But the Mavericks have, he's got to. That's definitely just got to be a self-infliction point. If he has the energy, if he has the health to be able to summon throughout the last 2-3 games of this series potentially, to have more of a Luka Doncic playoff-esque performance, then we are going to need that, because I think the Clippers are only going to grow in confidence after getting a game like this without Kawhi heading back home, even though Kawhi's health is obviously up in question for the rest of the series.
yeah, absolutely. I think, like I said before, I think that pretty much covers game 4. But yeah, I mean, look, the Mavericks have to regain some momentum in Los Angeles going into game 5. Obviously, that's better. That's easier said than done. But the Mavericks, have to start with more energy. I'm not even sure what time Wednesday night's game is, but I know it's not going to be a matinee affair, so the Mavericks aren't going to go down, or knock on wood, hopefully they don't go down 31 points in the first half. But
And
obviously things have to switch up for the Mavericks for the better. And look, I think overall you could have gained about as much momentum in this game, or as far as a playoff loss goes, the Mavericks gained about as much momentum as you possibly could. So I think if you're looking at positives throughout this game, that's definitely one of them. Obviously Kyrie, probably one of his best playoff performances of all time.
Yeah.
But yeah, Kyrie or Luca rather, and he mentioned this post game that he needs to be better for Kyrie,
And I
and I
mean,
agree with that statement. He does need
yeah,
to be better. So
no, I would definitely agree. And I mean, like we said, we don't know exactly what Luke is dealing with right now. Like he had a 29-point triple double tonight, and if he's dealing with an injury to the degree of, that's deterring his shot in the manner that it sort of is. If it really like is that bad, then hey, it is just one of those tough reality type checks. That the Mavericks may not be able to win this series if Luka's health is not where it needs to be. And hey, like that's not even really necessarily an indictment on Luka if if this knee soreness is really something that would be keeping him out of games during the regular season, which I mean I think it very well could be. But also, I'm sure that part of it's psyche, kind of mental aspect of it, where he may just not feel as comfortable because of that injury. I mean, this is not to equate me to the Mavericks in any sort of sense or Luka, but I recently hurt my foot playing basketball with Jaren about 2 weeks ago. And hey, look, it's kind of like it was, not necessarily like a huge injury. I kind of popped the toe ligament out of place, and I guess it kind of like popped back in. But just anecdotally, I can speak that I've been playing a little bit of pickup basketball more so than I have recently, and it's definitely been like a confidence thing in me, in terms of games, like planning off that right
yeah,
foot,
it's day-to-day
being
injury.
able, yeah, being able to, it's feeling a lot better now. It's honestly, at the stages of, I think
Complete.
finally,
Yeah.
finally complete healing, probably like maybe 1 or 2 more days, but just in terms of like hooping and stuff, still stuff like that, that takes a little bit longer, and I could definitely see how that could be affecting his confidence from a mental standpoint. Just having gone through something similar to that, even though I'm not an NBA player in any sense, just having a recent minor injury. So that's not to give any excuses for Luca or anything like that, but if he is really dealing with something, it's not like we're giving him the easiest task as fans and analysts of the Mavericks to, come and have some gaudy playoff performance while his knee, he can probably, he's probably walking with a limp outside of, these games. But
Yeah.
we really don't know. Like we said, we don't know the severity of this. We don't know how much is actually, dealing, how much it's affecting Luca if he's making the choice to play, which I'm sure isn't entirely his, but the Mavericks athletic training staff and whatnot too. Then his mental discipline with this, in terms of not letting this injury affect him. He's going to have to do as good of a job as he is, and that's just the reality, or as he can, and that's just the reality of the situation. That's not a knock on him. That's just the sort of state of the union. But hopefully things change for the better in Game 5. Obviously, the Mavericks were able to snag Game 5 in Los Angeles in 2021. The last time these two teams played, then they were tied up 2-2. So we will see if they were able to have something of similar effect in this series. Obviously, the Mavericks won the first 2 games of the series that series and then lost both games at home. So it was a little different there. Each team got one on the road, one at home in this series. I don't know, man. I think everybody who's covering the Mavericks right now, our head is sort of in a whirlwind. But I think some not simple because it's not easy to carry over adjustments, even though you can diagnose what actually needs to
Yeah.
happen. But I think that there were some adjustments that really showed themselves to the forefront that the Mavericks will need to make in Game 5, and I think that in come Game 5, we're going to need to see those, and I think we saw this in Game 3, the Mavericks having a sort of revert back to the mean with some of their role players shooting better. If Luka is going to continue to play like this, then they're definitely going to need their best performance of the series from their role players from a shooting perspective. I know we didn't really talk about like Josh Green, Dante X. I'm not going to hammer them at the end of the podcast or anything like that, but if we could get a couple of those guys making some threes, PJ Washington maybe being a little bit more consistent like he was in that game too, that could be huge. Obviously, we saw Derek Jones Jr. make 2 last night, but we would it's got to be just more than one Mavericks role player if
Yeah.
Luka's not going to be able to make step back threes at the level he is, and not able to get to the rim at the level he is. But hey, we've been kind of going off on a tangent, here at the end for a while, but I think these 2 games, more so Game 4, of course, which is how up and down of a game that was, and how much it kind of I think just showed the dynamics of this series. I think it deserved a lot of coverage. So happy that we talked a lot about this here today, Jaren. If there's anything else that you'd like to say before we end this podcast, all right.
I think I'm all good.
Yeah, then
Hopefully, obviously a win in Game 5 is I think, whatever team does take game 5 is pretty much going to take the series.
Yes.
Hopefully the Mavericks take game 5, obviously going back home for game 6, and what will be probably a crazy atmosphere, assuming
Yes.
we win.
The talking points of this podcast could be drastically different here in a week.
Yeah.
Or we could still be on the playoff train. It's funny that we start our podcast up at this juncture. It just seems like we didn't. It sucks that we, weren't able to do it for the vast majority of the regular season, because it seems like, in terms of our podcasting coverage, everything we accelerated so fast into the Mavericks playoff run. It could easily just be swept under the rug just like that. That is the reality of the NBA season. That's why we stress, every intricate detail, during these podcasts, during the regular season, as much as we do, because they matter come playoff time, even as, as good as Dante Exum's been playing recently, for instance. His impact in this series has been negligible. And we'll dissect the series at large when it's over, in terms of everything that went wrong if the Mavericks end up losing this. But this game 4, I think we will be talking a lot about if they end up losing this series, which is an unfortunate reality. But hopefully the Mavericks bounce back in LA on Wednesday night. Me and Jaren will hopefully be watching that game together. Hopefully, and we will be back on the mic Wednesday night or Thursday morning, whenever we are able to podcast. But hopefully we are coming to you guys with a far less somber tone. But other than that, this has been Will and Jaren on the Mainstream Mavs podcast. No question today for the YouTube listeners. We went over a little on the time limit anyways. So when the theoretical time limit, we don't have time limits over here at the Mainstream Mavs podcast.
We go for whenever we like.
This is not the Locked On Mavs podcast. With that being said, this is Will and Jaren on the Mainstream Mavs podcast. We'll catch you guys in the next one.
Peace.